April 14, 1943. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, Pearl Harbor. In a cramped room, humming with fans and fluorescents, a pencil skated across paper as a line of blocky kana resolved into English. The intercept had come across the ether as routine Japanese naval traffic. Under practiced hands, it became anything but. The origin was unmistakable. Commander-in-Chief, Combined Fleet. The content was surgical in its precision. An inspection tour itinerary for Admiral Yamamoto with exact times, locations, and routing. Departure 0600 hours, Tokyo time, April 18th from Rabaul. Arrival, Balalele Airfield, 0800 hours, Tokyo time. 2 Type 1 medium bombers as transports, an escort of 60 fighters, the sort of detail a planner prizes, and an ambusher lives for. Technical Sergeant Harold Fudena, a Nisei translator with the Military Intelligence Service, checked his rendering twice against the cipher groups, pausing only to straighten the sheets already curling from the humidity. The message was painfully specific. Aircraft types, legs, and arrival windows, laid out as if by a metronome. Commander William Goggins, running FRUPAC operations, understood the signal on first read. The information wasn't merely good, it was usable. In minutes, the translation was on the desk of Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer. Layton read, then read again, and the implication sharpened like a blade. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, would pass through a window where American fighters could just reach him. A single chance. No repeats. None of them, at that moment, could know that this one decrypted strip would set in motion one of the boldest fighter interceptions in the history of aviation. What they did know was the psychology of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders weren't just officers, they were emblems. Strike the emblem and you fracture belief. Yamamoto was the brightest emblem of them all. Harvard-educated, a practiced poker player, acquainted with America in a way few of his peers were. He had warned Tokyo about U.S. industry and the tempo it could sustain. He had argued against war, and when overruled, he had engineered Pearl Harbor with cold arithmetic, then accumulated early Pacific victories before a flock of American codebreakers helped upset the table at Midway. Across the ocean, the American lever would be the Lockheed P-38G Lightning at Fighter Strip No. 2, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, twin Allison V-1710-89-91 engines, a 414 mph top end at 25,000 feet, twin booms tied by a broad horizontal tail, and a center nacelle cradling pilot and guns, 4 Browning AN-M2 250 caliber machine guns, and a Hispano M2 20mm cannon, all aligned in the nose, all converging on whatever the pilot could hold in the sights. 2 165-gallon drop tanks would stretch the Lightning's reach beyond 450 miles of combat radius. In that theater, nothing else American with a single seat could go that far and still fight. Major John William Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, stood over maps and weather sheets inside the dugout at Henderson. Over 2,000 hours in everything with wings had made his brain a tidy navigator. Distance from Guadalcanal to the intercept, 435 miles straight. But straight was suicide. Straight crossed Japanese-held islands full of eyes and listening sets. The smart line swung out to sea before knifing north. At 165 miles, outbound 600 miles, return 400, 1,000 miles total with fuel to spare for only minutes of combat at emergency power. The arithmetic had no mercy. Fuel figures sketched their own cliff edge. Standard P-38G internal capacity. 300 gallons main, 60 reserve. Add 330 gallons in twin 165-gallon tanks. Total 690 gallons, on paper. Cruise burn, about 50 gallons per hour per engine at low altitude, climbing with power and height. Ideal flying time, just over 5 hours 45 minutes. Required for this profile, at minimum, 4 hours 30 minutes if navigation were flawless and the winds honest. The error budget, once combat and headwinds arrived, approached 0. Among the men who would stake their lives on that math was Captain Thomas George Lanier, Jr., the son of a decorated World War I aviator who had served on Billy Mitchell's staff. Tall, broad-shouldered, already credited with 5 victories, some debated, Lanier carried both a taste for risk and a knack for selling the legend while it was still being made. At 27, he understood that the mission's outcome could propel him into a larger story beyond the war. First Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber came from a different American mold. An Oregon farm boy who had studied engineering at Oregon State before enlisting in September 1940, Barber flew as he did most things. Deliberate, efficient, without theatrical flourish. His victories came from geometry more than bravado. Position first, then a short, surgical burst. Move on. At 25, he could see a dogfight not as chaos, but as a 3-dimensional diagram animated by speed, vectors, and timing. At Lakunai Airfield in Rabaul, aboard a Mitsubishi G4M1, Type 1 bomber number 323, Admiral Yamamoto reviewed his inspection schedule. The Betty, as American pilots named it, was a paradox Japan had learned to live with. Superb range, 2,150 miles, purchased by sacrificing armor and self-sealing tanks. Maximum 265 mph at 19,085 feet, a 200 mph cruise, and a reputation among crews that earned it nicknames invoking cigars and lighters. For this tour, 6 A6M3 Model 32-0s from the 204th Air Group would ride herd over the 2 bombers. Yamamoto, 59, remained the Imperial Navy's clearest strategist. Born Isoroku Takano and adopted into the Yamamoto family, 5 feet 3, but carrying himself with samurai restraint, his left hand missing 2 fingers to shrapnel from Tsushima aboard the armored cruiser Nishin. The loss had not dimmed his calligraphy, his poker, or the presence that made subordinates stand straighter. He had hitchhiked America between 1919 and 1921 while at Harvard. Detroit's plants, Texas's refineries, California's factories, coming away convinced that war against such capacity was unwinnable beyond a brief early run. He had said as much in the line about running wild for 6 months, maybe a year, and having no confidence after. For the Americans, the critical condition was silence. If the Japanese suspected compromise, Yamamoto's flight would vanish into another schedule or not fly at all. The codebreakers at Station Hypo, now Frupak, had clawed into the JN-25 variants since before Midway. Their decrypts had grown from fragments into almost whole messages. Each successful read risked revealing that very success. Approving action on this intercept had therefore climbed a tall ladder. Admiral Chester Nimitz commanding Pacific Fleet, Admiral William Bull Halsey over the South Pacific area, Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell for the Solomons, and ultimately President Franklin Roosevelt himself, who by one account distilled the decision into 3 words: get Yamamoto. Mission design became a team sport conducted at midnight pace. Marine Major John Condon, operations officer for Commander Aircraft, Solomons, sketched the first flight plan. Fuel, winds, waypoints. Mitchell examined it and shook his head. The speeds and timings wouldn't suit the P-38's peculiarities. He rebuilt the profile from the ground up alongside his pilots, leg by leg, until the route wove around Japanese observation posts and radar arcs while still landing the formation at the right second in the right square of sky. The final plan broke into 5 legs, each a heading, time, and distance pair, each adjusted for forecast winds and compass deviation. Over so great a reach, 1 sloppy degree would push the formation miles out of place with no fuel to hunt. Intelligence weighed the calendar and found omens the enemy might ignore. April 18th would mark a year to the day since the Doolittle Raiders crossed Tokyo, symbol upon symbol. Weather predictions promised scattered cloud and good visibility. Radio analysis showed no tightening in Japanese communications. If surprise could be kept intact, the blow would land with both fists. The escort problem occupied equal space on the planning board. The A6M3 Model 32-0 could outturn a P-38 at low and medium altitudes, climbing at 3 to 100 feet per minute and turning inside almost anything at under 20,000 feet. But the Zero bought those gifts with ruthless weight cuts, about 3,180 pounds empty to the P-38's 12,780, no armor for the pilot beyond a thick windscreen, no self-sealing tanks, and structures built to the thinnest margins. A turning brawl would be fatal for Lightnings. A fast, diving attack with the P-38's sturdiness and concentrated fire might be fatal for the Zeros and their charges. Lieutenant Besby Frank Holmes had pored over Zero tactics. He knew the escorts tended to sit 1,000 to 1,500 feet high and a bit aft, 2 3-plane shays, doctrine pushing them to swat attackers while the bombers plowed on. Surprise from below and behind, especially sudden, unexpected angles, often froze those formations for just long enough. On April 17, 2000 hours, the briefing tent filled until elbows met canvas. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, who had championed naval aviation and commanded USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid, addressed the pilots directly. 18 P-38s would go. 4 would be the killer element, tasked with the bombers. 12 would climb to top cover against the likely surge from Kahili Airfield, an imagined wall of fighters that, if encountered, could swallow the mission whole. 2 more would launch as spares. The killer quartet, Captain Lanier, Lieutenant Barber, Lieutenant Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine. The spares, Lieutenants James Malanahan and Joe Moore. Mitchell's navigation brief came like a metronome. Leg 1, magnetic 200 to 65 degrees for 55 minutes at 30 to 50 feet over the water, 183 miles. Leg 2, 290 degrees for 27 minutes, 89 miles. Leg 3, 305 degrees for 38 minutes, 125 miles. Leg 4, 330 degrees for 16 minutes, 52 miles. Leg 5, 290 degrees for 21 minutes, 70 miles, climbing to attack altitude near the end. The waypoints were drawn to thread gaps between New Georgia, Vella La Vella, and the Treasury Islands while riding forecast wind drift. There was no safety net. Over such distances, 1 degree wrong for an hour would betray the formation to the sea. Every detail underlined the mission's narrow margin. Pilots would strap on Mae West life preservers and jungle survival kits, understanding that a water landing meant sharks and exposure, while a bailout over Bougainville meant capture and outcomes that recent intelligence had learned to describe in blunt, brutal terms. Each man carried a Colt M1911A1 45th, last resort, and symbol both. Weather, reviewed by Lieutenant Colonel Luther S. Moore, offered probabilities, not promises. Surface winds southeast 8 knots, 5,000 feet south at 15, 10,000 feet southwest 22. Solomon weather could bubble thunderheads from nowhere inside an hour. The estimate of 70% favorable sounded reassuring on paper and frail in a cockpit. Radio would be silence. The P-38's SCR-274N sets were tuned to 6710 kilocycles, a frequency unlikely to draw Japanese ears, but the rule stood: no chatter. Mitchell would be the clock and the compass. No beacon would bless them with fixes. No lighthouse of islands could be risked in daylight. One man's dead reckoning would lead 18 airplanes across 600 miles of ocean to a target moving at a few miles a minute. As the pilots turned to their aircraft, Lieutenant Julius Jack Jacobson pulled the armorers close for one last check. 4 Brownings, 500 rounds each, belts of M2 ball, M1 incendiary, and M2 armor-piercing in a 4-1-1 sequence, plus a 20mm cannon with 150 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing. At max cyclic, those Brownings would drain in under 37 seconds, the cannon in less than 12. On this mission, every press of the trigger had to be timed, aimed, and decisive. Before dawn on April 18th, ground crews moved with ritual exactness under crew chiefs who knew how many mistakes the Pacific would forgive. None. Master Sergeant Leo B. Godfrey watched each ammunition belt seat, each shackle lock. Internal tanks brimmed, 360 gallons. Drop tanks verified at 160 each. Oil, hydraulics, control surfaces, and the little things that killed airplanes when no one was looking, all checked, then checked again. A missed cotter pin could be the difference between a clean release and a tank hanging in the slipstream like a brake. At Rabaul, the Japanese ran their own ritual. The 11th Air Fleet obeyed procedures refined by hard loss. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka had argued against the trip. American fighter activity had spiked around Bougainville since the February evacuation of Guadalcanal, and reports put nearly 200 American fighters within reach from Guadalcanal, the Russells, and other fields. Yamamoto insisted on going in person to congratulate the men of Operation Uego, whose claims of kills against American shipping were greater than the reality, but still a point of pride. Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Hayashi prepared tale number 323 from the 705th Air Group. Solid maintenance record, 47 missions behind it, extra fuel in the bomb bay, and the Admiral's seat set on the left behind the pilot for a wide view. A special mount held Yamamoto's family katana, an heirloom from the Momoyama period. The 6 escorts from the 204th Air Group were veterans averaging more than 500 combat hours. Among them, Petty Officer First Class Shoi Sugita, destined to become one of Japan's leading aces before his death in 1945, and Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanaga, a 100-mission pilot who considered protecting the combined fleet's commander an honor. At 07:25 local time on April 18th, Mitchell's P-38s lifted from fighter strip number 2 exactly in the order rehearsed. Mitchell led, then his 3, then the killer element, then cover. Fate trimmed the roster at once. Lieutenant Malanahan's tire blew on the roll, the lightning skating off the coral, pilot unharmed but out. Lieutenant Joe Moore's fuel transfer pump failed after takeoff, drop tank fuel unreachable. He turned back. 16 lightnings pressed on. They leveled at wave height, 30 to 50 feet, salt spray stippling windscreens within minutes. For 2 hours and more, they would fly there. No radio, eyes locked on formation cues, hands constantly adjusting prop, throttle, and trim, minds counting minutes against headings while the Pacific unrolled beneath them in hypnotic swells. The sun turned canopies into greenhouses. The engine note settled into a droning chant that lulled even the most vigilant. Pilots fought drowsiness with singing, face slaps, and the math of fuel. Lieutenant Roger J. Ames watched his consumption climb beyond the neat plan. His drop tanks were dragging more than predicted, an angle off, a manufacturing quirk. Who could say? The reserve tallied itself, perhaps 5 minutes upon return. Too much speed spent now, and the end would be in the sea. Too much thrift, and there would be no power left to fight. At 0600 Tokyo time, 0800 local, Yamamoto's 2-bomber formation lifted from Rabaul precisely on schedule. The Admiral wore dress whites with full decorations, the Order of the Chrysanthemum and the Order of the Golden Kite among them, intending to project the Navy's prestige forward. Witnesses would later recall a somberness about him, the sense of a man who could do the math on risk as well as any. Vice Admiral Matei Ugaki, his chief of staff and close friend, took the second Betty, number 326. The formation climbed to 6,500 feet. Escorts settled into 2 3-plane elements. Visibility ran clear, with scattered cumulus at 4,000 to 5,000 feet, hinting at concealment without truly granting it. Warrant Officer Kenji Yanaga scanned the sky with the acuity born of years, able to sort aircraft types at distances where others saw only motes, able to feel movement at the edge of his vision. Habit, not fear, kept him in tight formation. The Rabaul to Balalele route had been flown dozens of times. American fighters had never swarmed this far north in force. Operational mishap felt the likelier enemy. At 0934 local time, after 2 hours and 9 minutes over open ocean, Mitchell's formation hit the last turn point on schedule tight enough to make a navigator smile. He checked his specially synchronized Elgin watch and signaled the turn northwest. If the wind estimates were wrong, they would now miss a target that would never reappear. If they were right, they would arrive slightly early. The P-38s banked as one. Then the prize appeared. Lieutenant Douglas S. Canning, Mitchell's wingman, called it first, breaking radio silence with a single electric phrase. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. Range about 5 miles, 6,000 feet above. 8 aircraft, marching in clean formation. 2 Betty bombers in echelon, 6 zeros in 2 neat elements, exactly where the math had said they would be. Mitchell felt the jolt of joy and fear that accompanies good fortune when it lands on time. They had found the needle in the largest hayfield on Earth. He ordered the drop tanks gone. "Skin them, tanks, all flights. Let's get them." The 2 165-gallon canisters fell away across the formation, tumble spinning toward the sea. Throttles forward, war emergency power, 1,475 horsepower per engine, and the Lightnings began their climb. The plan snapped into motion, the killer flight down and in, Mitchell's cover climbing to catch anything that rose from Kahili. Below, the escorts above the bombers began to stir, drop tanks off, angles changing. Standard doctrine would carry them toward the attackers while the bombers tried to run. The outcome of the Pacific's longest fighter interception had turned from a calculation into a countdown. Chapter 2. The Men, the Machines, and the Math. The mission drew strength from 3 pillars: people, airplanes, and arithmetic, each tightening the other 2 until there was no slack left anywhere. The people first. Major John William Mitchell carried the burden of navigation and the tempo of the fight before a single engine turned. More than 2,000 hours in everything from trainers to the newest combat types had turned him into a human flight computer. Distances, headings, winds, and times lived in his head as tidy columns. His job was to make the ocean small and the clock precise. The margin he kept repeating to the squadron was the same: none. Captain Thomas George Lanier Jr. was charisma sharpened by ambition. The son of a World War I officer who had worked alongside Billy Mitchell, he understood lineage and the uses of reputation. Tall, self-assured, already credited with 5 kills, some contested, he flew with aggression and a sense that history had left a space with his name penciled in. This operation, he believed, could ink it permanently. First Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber, by contrast, seemed carved out of Oregon basalt, quiet, practical, and governed by the satisfactions of a clean solution. He had left Oregon State's engineering classrooms to fly, and the discipline followed him into combat. He preferred to arrive where the geometry made the shot simple, squeeze the trigger in a short, lethal pulse, and break away without theatrics. Where Lanier chased moments, Barber hunted outcomes. Opposite them, the Japanese assembled their own constellation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Harvard veteran, poker player, survivor of Tsushima's shrapnel, stepped into a Betty bomber because duty demanded presence at the front. Vice Admiral Mate Ugaki settled into the second Betty, a chief of staff who had shared both victory and doubt with the Admiral. Their escort from the 204th Air Group included hardened hands. Petty Officer First Class Shoi Sugita, on a path to become one of Japan's leading aces before war's attrition stopped him, and Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanaga, a 100-mission pilot whose eyes were trained to catch movement where others saw only sky. Between these people stood the machines. On Guadalcanal's Fighter Strip No. 2, the Lockheed P-38G Lightning crouched with the look of applied physics. Twin Allison V-1710-8991 engines slung outboard, twin booms tied together by a broad horizontal stabilizer, and a center nacelle containing the pilot and every gun the designers could comfortably fit. All firepower, 4 Browning AN M250 caliber machine guns and a Hispano M2 20mm cannon, sat in the nose. No convergence problems, no guessing where wing lines would cross. Whatever filled the site was going to be sawn apart if the pilot held it long enough. With two 165-gallon drop tanks to feed the 300-gallon mains and 60-gallon reserve, the Lightning had reached no other American fighter in the theater could match. At 25,000 feet, it could run 414 mm. It could also dive hard without shaking itself to pieces, a trait that mattered when the opponent prized turning over structure. The Japanese side flew a different equation. The Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty reached far, 2,850 miles worth of far, by throwing armor and self-sealing away. Its speed numbers, 265 mph, at 19,085 feet, 200 mph in cruise, sufficed until bullets found tanks, and the airplane justified the nicknames crews whispered about lighters and cigars. Protection would come, on this day, from 6 A6M3 Model 32 Zeros, a variant that could flick and climb and carve inside almost anything at low to medium altitudes. At 3,180 pounds empty, the Zero felt like a thought given wings. But the weight came off somewhere. Pilot armor was a pane of bullet-resistant glass. The tanks were not self-sealing. Structural margins were calculated thin. The P-38 could not outturn it below 20,000 feet, but it could outrun it in a dive and live with the stresses the Zero could not. The arithmetic brought the two sides into the same box of sky. Mitchell's planners had boiled the route into 5 legs, each a heading married to a minute count and a distance tally that accounted for the forecast winds and the quirks of a magnetic compass. A single degree of slop, nursed over hundreds of miles, would slide the formation into emptiness with no fuel to search. The outbound leg alone, flown wide to avoid eyes and wireless ears on New Georgia, Vella Lavella, and the Treasury Islands, grew to roughly 600 miles. The return added 400. 1,000 miles of commitment for perhaps 7 minutes of fighting at emergency power if everything else went right. Fuel numbers had the grim ring of a balance sheet read aloud. Internal capacity, 300 gallons in the mains, 60 in reserve. External, 2 165-gallon tanks for another 330. Total, 690 gallons, to buy 5 hours 45 minutes under friendly conditions. Required, not less than 4 hours 30 minutes if winds behaved and the stopwatch stayed honest. Factor in a climb, a dash, a fight, a turn home, and the reserve shrank to single-digit minutes. Burn too fast early and you never saw Guadalcanal again. Conserve too much and you arrived for the attack without the power to maneuver. The mission was a line strung tight between those two mistakes. Gear and weapons only underlined the stakes. Radio silence would be absolute. The SCR-274N sets, retuned to 6710 kilocycles, were a last resort, not a crutch. Each pilot carried a Colt M1911A1 45 with extra magazines, a talisman that acknowledged what capture meant in that corner of the Pacific as the war wore on. May West life preservers would help if an engine quit over the ocean. Jungle survival kits, water purification tablets, rations, fishing line, basic medical supplies were the only mercy available over Bougainville. No illusions softened the brief. Sharks in the water, execution if found ashore, and in between a long wait if any rescue came at all. Ammunition discipline would decide seconds that mattered. 4 Brownings, 500 rounds each, belts laced with M2 ball, M1 incendiary, and M2 armor-piercing in a 4-1-1 rhythm, spit between 750 and 850 rounds a minute per gun. The 20mm cannon cradled 150 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. At maximum rate, a pilot could pour less than 37 seconds of 50-caliber fire and under a dozen seconds of cannon into the air before the noses went quiet. The P-38's great gift, concentrated fire from the centerline, meant those brief bursts could sever a spar or open a fuel line in a single, precise rake. It also meant there was nothing to waste. On the ground, ritual and redundancy took over. Master Sergeant Leo B. Godfrey's crews topped internal tanks to 360 gallons and verified 160 in each jettisonable tank. Shackles were tested again and again. A single sticky release could wreck drag figures and mission timing. Belts were checked for seating and feed. Oil levels, hydraulics, and the feel of each control surface were run through by hands that had learned the cost of trusting luck. Everything that could be squared away would be. Everything that could break still might. Across the sea, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka argued against the entire notion of Yamamoto's tour. Since Japan's withdrawal from Guadalcanal in February, American fighter strength had thickened around Bougainville, and whispers put nearly 200 enemy fighters at striking distance from Guadalcanal, the Russells, and other strips. Yet Yamamoto insisted. The pilots of Operation Waigo had earned the honor of his congratulations. Their claims from the recent offensive, 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, 25 transports, far outran the reality of losses inflicted. 1 destroyer, 1 corvette, 1 tanker, 2 cargo ships. Pride, protocol, and the need for leadership's presence overrode the caution. Tale number 323 from the 705th Air Group, 47 combat sorties without serious mechanical trouble, was set aside for the Admiral. Extra fuel rode in the bomb bay. The Admiral's seat sat on the left behind the pilot for a better view. His family katana sat in a special mount that spoke of both ceremony and history. Weather, the last and least reliable partner, offered probabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Luther S. Moore briefed winds from the southeast at 8 knots on the surface, 15 from the south at 5,000 feet, 22 from the southwest at 10,000. In the Solomons, forecast confidence never extended far. Towering cumulus could build out of blue in an hour. Even a subtle headwind could nibble the reserve down to fumes. The estimate of 70% favorable sounded, to the pilots, like a coin with a nick in it. Doctrine on both sides would shape the first seconds of contact. Lieutenant Besby Frank Holmes had studied how Zero escorts flew, close cover 1,000 to 1,500 feet above and slightly behind their charges. 2 neat 3-plane elements, chaise, ready to pounce. When surprised from angles below and behind, especially with the sun and clouds complicating perspective, those formations could pause just long enough. Japanese doctrine demanded the escorts move to intercept and occupy attackers, trusting the bombers to speed and defensive guns. American planners meant to punish that reflex by forcing the choice, protect the bombers or fight the fighters. The last piece was secrecy, welded to authority. Frupak's leverage over JN-25 had only grown since Midway, from fragments to almost whole messages. Each time the Americans acted on that knowledge, they risked telling their opposite numbers that the lock was already broken. Approvals rose stepwise. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Admiral William Bull Halsey, Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, and finally landed at the White House, where President Franklin Roosevelt, by one recollection, issued the simplest possible guidance. The message had named the place and the hour. The Americans would supply the patience and the reach. By the night of April 17th, the pieces had clicked into alignment. The killer flight, Lanier, Barber, Holmes, Hine, would go straight for the transports. 12 more Lightnings would climb into a shield overhead to catch whatever roared up from Kahili. 2 spares would launch to cover bad luck. Timings, headings, and fuel were etched into memory. The only thing that could be added before dawn was resolve. Everything after that would be decided in minutes. Before the sky over Bougainville erupted in fire, the mission existed only as endurance, a long, low flight over a restless ocean. At 07:25 local time, April 18, 1943, the first P-38 lifted from Henderson Field's coral strip on Guadalcanal. The takeoff plan was as tight as every other calculation. Major John Mitchell led the procession, his Lightning climbing barely above the palms, followed by his own flight, then Captain Lanier's killer element, and the top cover groups behind. One by one, the Lightnings roared down the crushed coral runway, the twin booms glinting in the early sun. Within minutes, the formation flattened out to a few dozen feet above the Pacific, the propellers cutting salt spray into mist. Fate trimmed the formation immediately. Lieutenant James Mullanahan's right tire exploded midway through his takeoff run. His P-38 veered sideways, skidded into a cloud of coral dust, and tore off a landing gear. He was shaken, but alive, and out. Then Lieutenant Joe Moore, climbing into formation, found his drop tank pump dead. Without access to the 330 gallons riding under his wings, he would never make the range. Moore turned back toward Guadalcanal while the others pressed on. 16 lightnings remained, 2 fewer than planned. At 30 to 50 feet over the water, radio silence reigned. The only sounds were the engine drones, a muted hiss of slipstream, and the rhythmic whisper of the ocean below. The Pacific rolled endlessly, long, low swells marked by white seams of foam. The horizon merged with haze so perfectly that it became impossible to tell where sea ended and sky began. Mitchell flew by instruments, but his true compass lived in his mind. Time, airspeed, drift, and the small deviations no gauge could show. Dead reckoning, the oldest, loneliest form of navigation, would have to be flawless for 600 miles. 2 hours of this monotonous flight stretched every pilot's nerves. The cockpit heat grew unbearable. The greenhouses of plexiglass turned into ovens. Sweat collected in flight suits, soaking through. The ocean's hypnotic rhythm threatened to pull their eyes down and dull their awareness. Pilots fought fatigue with small acts of rebellion. Some sang loudly through oxygen masks, others slapped their cheeks or flexed gloved hands against the control yokes. Each lightning flew on the knife edge between caution and necessity. At that altitude, a sneeze on the stick could mean disaster. Engines guzzled fuel more efficiently in thin air, but the need for stealth forced them to skim the waves where drag was higher. Salt spray filmed the windshields within minutes, forcing constant wiping. Lieutenant Roger Ames, part of the cover flight, noticed a subtle wrongness in his gauges. His external tanks seemed to be drawing unevenly, perhaps a flawed shackle, perhaps manufacturing tolerance. It meant more drag, more burn. He recalculated on his kneeboard. He might land back at Guadalcanal with only 5 minutes of fuel remaining, assuming perfect navigation. That assumption had to hold. Meanwhile, far to the northwest, Yamamoto's own morning began in almost ceremonial calm. At Lacunay Airfield in Rabaul, the humid air shimmered with exhaust as the 2 Betty bombers warmed their engines. Crew chiefs checked the 20mm Type 99 cannons in the tail and dorsal positions. Yamamoto, immaculate in his white uniform, stepped aboard Bomber 323. His sword rested beside his seat, a relic of family honor and symbol of the samurai line from which he had descended. At 0800 local time, 0600 Tokyo time, the formation rolled down the runway and lifted into clear air. To the Admiral's staff, the flight was routine. They had flown this same route many times before, from Rabaul to Balalele, 315 miles to the southeast. The skies were blue, with high, puffy cumulus and calm wind. Yamamoto spoke softly to his aide about the schedule ahead. A brief ceremony, inspection of facilities, words of encouragement to the air crews. The war, he said, would now depend on spirit more than material. Several officers later recalled an uneasy tone in his voice, as if he were reciting conviction rather than feeling it. Vice Admiral Mate Ugaki, in the second bomber, carried his own staff officers. They followed closely behind, both aircraft bracketed by 6 Zero escorts from the 204th Air Group. Each escort flight of 3 rode about 1,000 feet above and behind the bombers. Standard doctrine. Their pilots relaxed, but alert. None expected American fighters this deep in Japanese airspace. For nearly 2 hours, the 2 forces converged across hundreds of miles of open ocean, invisible to each other and unaware that their fates were entangled by mathematics. At 0934 local time, Mitchell's wristwatch ticked over the final mark. 2 hours and 9 minutes airborne. By his reckoning, they were at the intercept point. or they were lost. No radio beacon, no shoreline, only time and trust in the numbers. He checked his Elgin watch against his chart. The plan called for a left turn, northwest. If his wind correction was wrong, they would fly into nothing. If right, they would rise under the enemy's shadow. He waggled his wings. The silent signal. The 16 P-38s banked together and swung northwest. Then came the moment that proved the navigation perfect. Lieutenant Douglas Canning, flying as Mitchell's wingman, leaned forward against his harness, scanning the horizon. His voice finally broke 2 hours of silence. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. 8 specks hung against the bright blue. 2 larger, 6 smaller, the pattern exactly as expected. Range 5 miles, altitude 6,000 feet higher. They had found the needle in the Pacific's infinite haystack. Mitchell's command came crisp and final. Skin 'em tanks. 12 silver cylinders fell away and tumbled into the sea. The lightnings, freed of drag, surged forward and up. Throttles advanced to war emergency power. Twin Allisons screamed past 1,400 horsepower each. From above, the Japanese formation began to stir. The Zeros peeling slightly outward, the bombers maintaining their calm, methodical course toward Bougainville. In that moment, the Americans' 600-mile gamble balanced on a hair's edge. Below them stretched an ocean vast enough to swallow every mistake. Ahead, at the far end of the climb, waited the architect of Pearl Harbor. The Pacific sky, for hours an empty vault of blue, suddenly filled with motion. The lightnings had climbed from sea level into thin air, engines straining at war emergency power, each pilot watching the other's wingtips to maintain formation. The intercept had been calculated to the minute. Now it unfolded to the second. From his cockpit, Captain Thomas Lanier saw sunlight flash across the silver shapes ahead. 2 bombers in echelon, 6 fighters poised above and behind. The Japanese escorts were only beginning to react. They dropped their belly tanks in neat unison, the metal drums tumbling end over end toward the sea. Standard doctrine was in motion. Intercept the attackers, shield the bombers, let the formation push on. Mitchell ordered the split. His top cover flight would climb to 18,000 feet to meet any fighters from Kahili. The killer flight would strike from below and behind. The Americans' advantage was speed and surprise. Every second of confusion mattered. Lanier led the attack element, but within seconds the plan began to splinter. He saw the Zeros diving to engage and made a decision that would echo for decades. Instead of pressing through toward the bombers with Barber, he banked sharply to meet the Japanese fighters head-on. His later explanation was tactical: destroy the escorts to clear a path. His critics would forever suspect something else, that he saw an easier path to personal glory in a dogfight than in a disciplined attack on bombers. Lieutenant Rex Barber stayed on course. The Bettys had already begun to dive toward the jungle canopy, trying to escape by dropping altitude where the lightning's speed advantage would shrink. Barber pushed his nose down, following, his P-38's airspeed indicator climbing past 400 miles per hour. Through the gun sight, the lead bomber grew larger with terrifying speed. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. The bomber's dorsal gun flickered with orange points. At 500 yards, Barber squeezed the trigger. 4 streams of 50 caliber bullets and a line of 20mm cannon shells converged on the bomber's right engine and wing root. The impact looked like a door blown open in a furnace. Orange fire blossomed from the nacelle, the wing sheared, and the Betty rolled violently to the left, trailing flame. Barber pulled up hard, the P-38 groaning under the G-forces. For a moment he saw the Japanese bomber falling through trees, disintegrating as it struck the jungle near Moyla Point. A black column of smoke rose through the greenery. 1 bomber gone, but which carried Yamamoto? There was no way to tell. Behind him, chaos filled the sky. Lieutenant Besby Holmes and Lieutenant Raymond Hine, also of the killer flight, had become separated in the dive. Holmes spotted the second Betty racing south along Bougainville's coastline, barely above the water. He rolled in, fired a long burst, and saw fuel stream from the right engine before overshooting. The bomber continued, a white vapor trail marking its wound. Barber, regaining position, lined up for a second attack. The target skimmed 50 feet above the waves, its right engine smoking. He calculated the deflection, 30 degrees to lead, and fired. His tracers walked across the water, then into the bomber's fuselage. Panels flew off, fragments struck his windshield. The left engine erupted into flame. The pilot tried to ditch, but at 100 miles an hour too fast. The Betty struck the ocean, broke apart, and vanished in spray and smoke. In the melee above, Lanier's duel with the Zeros raged. He rolled inverted, dove, and claimed a kill, 1 Zero exploding in midair. Japanese records, later examined, would tell another story. None of the escorts were lost. Warrant Officer Kenji Yanaga's log described Zeros that drove off the Americans rather than fell to them. Their primary duty, to protect the bombers, had already failed, and survival now took precedence. Mitchell's top cover watched from altitude, scanning for the eruption of interceptors from Kahili Airfield only 20 miles away. None came. Either the Japanese base was slow to respond or entirely unaware. For all their calculations about fuel and wind, the Americans had found another ally. Surprise absolute. The fight lasted scarcely 10 minutes, the actual firing perhaps 3. When it ended, silence returned so suddenly it felt unnatural. Barber's aircraft was scarred but flyable. 104 bullet holes from the Betty's defensive guns, 1 hydraulic line severed, 1 engine running rough. Yet both Allisons held steady, the Lightning obedient. He leveled out, checked fuel, the needles were falling toward the red, and began the long turn south. Below, 2 plumes marked the graves of Yamamoto's convoy. Smoke rose from jungle and sea alike. The mission had done its work. Now survival was the only objective. The return would prove its own battle. Mitchell reformed what was left of the scattered flights, calling visual signals, not radio. Each man checked his instruments, recalculated fuel, and tried to believe his numbers. They had flown 2 hours and 20 minutes out. The return would take just as long. The difference between triumph and disappearance might be a handful of gallons. Lieutenant Holmes's right engine began to run rough. He throttled back, watching the formation drift ahead. Lieutenant Hines' gauges read perilously low. He considered diverting to Banneker Island's emergency strip, but feared Japanese patrols in the area. He chose to continue, trusting both engines and luck. The weather held. Scattered clouds, calm seas, visibility almost limitless. Each lightning flew alone inside its own calculations. Silence pressed in until it became a kind of company. At last, green ridgelines appeared on the horizon, the Russell Islands, and beyond them, Guadalcanal. The realization arrived slowly. They had made it. At 12:30 local time, Henderson Field came into view. Mitchell's navigation, after 1,000 miles of dead reckoning, had been flawless. Holmes landed with both engines sputtering, tanks essentially dry. Others touched down with less than 10 gallons remaining. One pilot estimated 3 minutes of flight time left. The difference between mission and catastrophe had been measured in coffee cups of gasoline. As the engines wound down and the noise faded, ground crews surrounded the aircraft, pointing out bullet holes and scorched panels. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the question that had followed every burst of gunfire finally rose. Did we get him? None could answer. They had seen 2 bombers fall, but not which carried the Admiral. The truth would travel by a slower route, through Japanese silence. That night, the pilots gathered in the mess hut built from scrap lumber and palm thatch. Captain Lanier, ever conscious of narrative, told his version with gusto, how he had rolled inverted and fired down into the bomber that carried Yamamoto. Others listened, some skeptically, some too exhausted to argue. Barber said little, The jungle of Bougainville would provide the answer. The next day, April 19th, Japanese search parties reached the wreckage inland from Moila Point. The Betty lay broken among trees, its wings scorched to silver skeletons. Yamamoto's body had been thrown clear, but still strapped in his seat. His white glove held his sword as though in salute. 2 bullet wounds, one through the shoulder, one through the jaw, told of death in mid-flight, not after. The most audacious fighter interception in history had succeeded. Chapter 5. Reckoning, Controversy, and Legacy. When the smoke cleared over Bougainville, the mission's silence began to roar in every other corner of the Pacific. In Rabaul, when Admiral Yamamoto failed to arrive at Balalele airfield, radio messages went out at first with puzzlement, then with alarm. By nightfall, the Japanese command knew the unthinkable. The commander of the combined fleet was missing. On April 19th, a search led by Lieutenant Commander Tabuchi Chagaru located the shattered remains of the lead Betty bomber. Scattered through dense jungle near Moila Point, its pieces were still warm, a tang of burned fuel and jungle smoke hanging in the humid air. Yamamoto had died instantly. The medical officer Dr. Tanaka later determined 1 bullet through his left shoulder, exiting above his right eye, another through the jaw. His white uniform was nearly unsoiled, his gloved hand still closed around the hilt of his family sword. Vice Admiral Mate Ugaki's bomber, which had crashed at sea, was also found. Ugaki and several others had survived, plucked from the water by Japanese patrols. His diary entries would later reveal both shock and admiration for the enemy's precision, and for the loss of the man Japan could least afford to lose. The psychological impact on the Imperial Navy was beyond measure. Yamamoto had been more than a strategist. He was the symbol of competence in a system increasingly governed by zeal. The American strike had not merely eliminated a commander, it had decapitated the mind of Japan's naval vision. Within hours, Japanese intelligence began the uncomfortable arithmetic of cause and coincidence. The timing was too exact, the interception too perfect. Someone had known. The question was how. To admit that American cryptographers had read their codes would have required acknowledging a failure at the heart of Japan's intelligence apparatus. Instead, Tokyo maintained a polite fiction. The admiral had died while directing operations at the front. For the Americans, victory came wrapped in silence. The pilots were ordered to say nothing, not to the press, not even to their families. The secret had to hold. If Japan suspected that its codes were compromised, the priceless flow of information that had guided Midway, Guadalcanal, and now Operation Vengeance would vanish. President Roosevelt heard the news, and, according to witnesses, nodded once and said simply, "We got him." Admiral Nimitz, satisfied but wary, ordered strict censorship. For more than a month, the American public would know nothing. When word finally broke, the glory carried its own shadows. Time magazine, in an October issue, mentioned Captain Lanier by name, nearly exposing the code-breaking secret and igniting the argument that would outlive most of the men involved. Lanier claimed he had delivered the fatal burst to Yamamoto's plane, describing an acrobatic inverted dive that eyewitnesses found improbable. Lieutenant Rex Barber remained quiet, offering a plain version. He had attacked the lead bomber from behind and below, then finished off the second. In the decades that followed, evidence, including Japanese accounts and the angle of bullet strikes, would vindicate Barber. The Betty carrying Yamamoto had been hit from below and behind, just as he described. Yet the official credit, mired in inter-service politics, gave each man half a kill. It would not be until 2003, 60 years later, that historians formally concluded Barber alone had brought down the Admiral's plane. Major John Mitchell, whose navigation had turned 600 miles of empty sea into a pinpoint interception, received the Navy Cross instead of the Medal of Honor. Bureaucratic caution, not lack of valor, denied him higher recognition. Every pilot who flew that day received the same award. They had done the impossible, but too publicly. In Japan, Yamamoto's death reverberated like a bell tolling through steel hulls. Emperor Hirohito ordered a state funeral, unprecedented for a military officer. On June 5, 1943, hundreds of thousands lined Tokyo's streets as his ashes were borne to Tama Cemetery. Another portion went to his hometown temple in Nagaoka. The official story insisted he had died in heroic action. The truth was too damaging to tell. For Japan's navy, the loss was more than personal. Yamamoto had been the only senior leader who understood America's scale, its industrial depth, its political endurance. He had once predicted, with prophetic clarity, that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but after that had no confidence. His death ensured that no voice of restraint remained. His successor, Admiral Minechi Koga, lacked his predecessor's vision and would himself die in a crash a year later. After that, the Imperial Navy moved from strategy to improvisation. The effects rippled outward. Without Yamamoto's tempering hand, Japan's planners turned increasingly to desperate measures: night attacks, one-way missions, and finally the kamikaze. His loss had not just demoralized the Navy, it had unbalanced it. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance became a study in the limits of perfection. A delay of 30 minutes, a shift of wind, or a single mechanical fault could have erased the formation in the ocean. Several returning P-38s landed with less than 10 gallons of fuel. Lieutenant Holmes's engines coughed to silence as his wheels touched the strip. The line between success and disaster had been drawn in spoonfuls of gasoline. Technical analysis afterward underscored what the mission had proven. Range was power. The P-38's twin engines and concentrated nosefire made it uniquely suited to long-range interception. Its success influenced every later American fighter program. The P-51D Mustang, the long-range escort that would eventually dominate the Pacific, inherited much from that lesson: range first, everything else after. The Japanese, for their part, never fully accepted how the Americans had found Yamamoto. They adjusted their codes incrementally, but never replaced them entirely. The same oversight would cost them again at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, where American commanders turned decrypted signals into ambushes. The pattern repeated: the sword of intelligence sharpened by patience and wielded by precision. Yet the moral weight of Yamamoto's death endured among those who had orchestrated it. Commander Edwin Layton, who had championed the mission, later admitted ambivalence. He had met Yamamoto years before, during pre-war exchanges. He respected the man, perhaps even liked him. "I knew he understood us," Layton would later write, and that made him dangerous. Killing him was necessary, but not without sadness. The war rolled on, but something had shifted. The Japanese myth of invincibility, personified by Yamamoto's intellect and composure, had been broken. Morale cracked. Hesitation crept into once fanatic councils. The victory disease that had driven Japan through its first triumphant months began to dissolve into fatalism. Operation Vengeance had done what thousands of bombs and shells had failed to do. It struck directly at the idea of Japan's inevitability. The war would grind on for 2 more brutal years, through Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and finally Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But after April 18, 1943, Japan's course no longer bent upward. For the men who flew that day, the aftermath was quieter, but no less heavy. Lieutenant Raymond Hine never returned from a later mission. His name joined the Pacific's long roll of missing. Captain Lanier left the service and turned to politics, his embellished version of events trailing him through speeches and campaigns. Rex Barber stayed with the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1961. He lived long enough to see the record corrected. His modesty, which had once made him invisible, eventually became its own proof. In military academies, Operation Vengeance became a case study: how intelligence, technology, and human skill could fuse into one stroke of precision. The codebreakers of Frupak, whose quiet work had made it all possible, remained largely anonymous. Their victory had been written not in bullets, but in patience, in the translation of one intercepted message that changed the war. The lessons endured. The P-38's design proved that range and firepower could rewrite the geometry of warfare. The planning proved that methodical calculation could outmatch myth, and the success proved that leadership, even in an industrial war, could still be personal. When historians later traced the threads of Japan's defeat, they found one running back to that morning over Bougainville. A brief flash of combat lasting barely 3 minutes that removed the only Japanese commander who truly understood what the United States was capable of becoming. April 18, 1943, had dawned with 18 pilots strapping into their aircraft and 1,000 miles of uncertainty in front of them. It ended with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto dead in the jungle, his sword beside him, and the balance of the Pacific tilted irreversibly toward Allied victory. Operation Vengeance had delivered exactly what its name promised, revenge for Pearl Harbor, but it had also ushered in a new era of warfare. Precision, intelligence, and audacity had replaced attrition as the new measure of power. In 3 minutes of battle, America had announced that no enemy, however revered, was beyond its reach.